Welcome to Blake Today. Hello, welcome to this new podcast about William Blake. I'm Douglas.
And I'm Sophia. We're going to be discussing Blake's influence on today's world. And I hope you're a fan of Blake.
So, if you know anything about Blake, he saw a tree filled with angels in Peckham Rye, conversed with the spiritual sun on Primrose Hill, and he was discovered by his acquaintance, Mr. Butts. Mr. Butts sitting stark naked in his summer house with his wife, and reciting lines from Milton's Paradise Lost in imitation of Adam and Eve. Sorry about the outtakes there. But yeah, no, this is our debut episode. So we're just going to have a bit of a chat really about, especially about songs of innocence and experience. Do you want to talk a bit about that, Sophia?
Yes, so, Blake was incredible in the way he was having visions, and he was a visionary from when he was just 8 years old. You know, he was a child and he was seeing these angels, and a lot of critics obviously say that he was just completely mad. But what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, so he said there are bright angelic wings spangling every bough like stars, which is a vision he had when he was just 8 years old, right? So he was, this isn't something he like kind of conjured up, right, later on in life. It's something he claims to have had from quite a young age. And this, these songs of innocent experience, right, they're very much related, I think, to those childhood experiences of, you know, his visions.
Yeah, you can see in his drawings as well, all the illustrations.
Yeah. So, like, the songs of innocent experience are a series of poems which initially appears for an audience of children, but then it also works for adults, right?
Would you read that to your children?
Well, okay, not all of them, to be fair, because a lot of them are somewhat. All fairy tales can be dark, right? If you think of like Hans Christian Andersen or something like that, but they're very dark in the sense of like they're quite heavy themes, right? So we're going to be talking about Garden of Love today, which is got some maybe more deep themes. So you could read them to a kid, but like they might not fully understand like the depth of the themes.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd want to read that to my children if I had children, I guess, because yeah, it does go quite deep. But to adults on the same idea, you know, a lot of people would just read Blake and read his songs, and you know, say they're just for children and there's no point in reading them. But there's actually a lot to unpack here. So we're gonna start with the Garden of Love, as Doug has said, and it's a song of experience. So we're going to read it to you guys, and then we're going to discuss it. The Garden of Love. I laid me down upon a bank where love lay sleeping. I heard among the rushes dank, weeping, weeping. Then I went to the heath and the wild, to the thistles and thorns of the waste, and they told me how they were beguiled, driven out and compelled to be chased. I went to the Garden of Love, and saw what I had never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and "Thou shalt not" writ all over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love, that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires. So I think we could go through the poem line by line, and sort of talk about each stanza. So the interesting thing about it, and this is more of like an overarching point, like the poem, even though it's a song of experience as opposed to a song of innocence, because Blake had 2 volumes, right? So one which was supposedly like innocent, maybe unexperienced. This one is supposed to be like after you've grown up, right? So you've got experience, but it's in between the two. So yeah, I think it's an intertwinement of innocence and experience. It's very interesting because, the language just sounds very innocent. It sounds childlike. It sounds like he's got these dreams when he goes to the garden, and then he's completely defeated. Yeah, like directly in the middle of the poem, right? It says, "I went to the Garden of Love, and saw what I never had seen.
a chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. So it starts, you could argue, innocent, because, where love lay sleeping, I mean, there's something in it which is very childlike and Edenic, and like the Garden of Eden, right? That's what I mean by that. So something happens, right? And it's the chapel that was built. So on the most basic level, probably Blake is talking about his experience with maybe his religious upbringing, or he feels that the priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires.
Imposition. Yeah, the
Yeah.
imposition. I mean, he was obviously. I mean, the Church of England. He was quite rebellious against all of.
Yeah, he was. He
Yeah.
had his a private faith, right, where like he didn't like, maybe you could say, organized religion, but in his vision of the Last Judgment, which is quite relevant because of the fact that, this is his own personal religious standing. He said this, and I'll just read out a passage, kind
Yeah.
of interesting. I assert for myself that I do not behold the outward creation, and that to me it is hindrance and not action. What? It will be questioned. When the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire, somewhat like a guinea? Oh, no, no. I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. I question not what my corporeal eye, any more than I could question a window concerning a sight. I look through it and not with it, from his A Vision of the Last Judgment. So you can tell that there's something mystical about his religious experience, but he doesn't like the imposition of the chapel. So that's why it says in the poem, the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. Like, he saw it as rules based and against his own freedom.
It is weird though, because if you think about it, I mean, religion usually, faith, it gives you freedom, it gives you openness, but in his poem, it's just all. It's restricting, it's imposing, it's not. And it's weird as well, in the illustration that accompanies the poem, the children are not inside the chapel, they're outside, like with the tombstones. So they're outsiders, they're not inside the chapel, they can't even see what's in there, it's hidden. So, I mean, we can see this kind of notion of authority emerging and this demand of obedience from the priests. And the language itself shows this when Blake says they're walking their round, that's something you associate with an authoritative figure. And, one could take this idea even further by seeing Blake's use of nursery rhymes, especially as a depiction of, the church's like manipulation of the minds of these children. A child has a highly impressionable mind. So then, bearing this in mind, internal rhymes that Blake uses, such as briars and desires, can be seen as satirical of almost an association that's deliberately imposed between a child's love for nursery rhymes and the church, the doctrine of the church. Again, it reminds me of Isaac Watts' hymns, where he says joys and desires, and these are imposed via the church onto children. And this whole idea is intensified through the illustration, where the children are in the garden, but they seem unaware of the garden, they're subdued, and they're directed towards the chapel. So, I mean, the church is limiting what the children should believe. So then this brings me to the question of, do you see this religious experience described by Blake as manipulative?
I think, yeah, like in the wrong kind of context. Like, so, in The Garden of Love, Blake is essentially painting a picture of the church as ruining innocence and bringing you to experience, right? That's why this poem is both of innocence and experience. So I think his more mystical approach is not limiting and is freeing, right? Whereas I think there's a lot of corruption throughout time, which is like kind of been highly imposing and like abuse of authority and power and that sort of thing. So definitely, this sort of religious context is very adverse. It's painted in a very adverse light for Blake, and I'd agree with that. It's not, you know, like
Yeah.
when you understand the context of the very.
But would you see
Mhm.
would you see all experience as limiting in a way? Or
No, I wouldn't, and I don't think that Blake would either. I think there's a fine line, and that fine line is to do with whether it's a freeing, visionary, mystical, personal experience rather than, you know, what I think he wouldn't like from Blake's perspective is dogmatic approaches. But I also, my personal opinion, think so you have to have a good balance though, because otherwise you can slip into like, you know, how many of Blake's experiences were actually like spiritually good for him, right? Or how many could have been harmful or false, right? Just like plain false. Like, was it just his imagination playing tricks on him? Was there anything truly divine, which is what he would have thought? And I definitely think there would be some, but it's like where do you draw the line? Like, how do you determine that? And that's why I think you need some level of like authority, but also enough, like definitely a lot of like freedom. Yeah, that's my opinion. But I think Blake wouldn't necessarily agree with like any dogma at all. So.
Yeah, I mean, he had some of his visions. He said they were trying to trick him, the visions themselves, by being
Yeah.
not who they were saying they were, and also, so you wouldn't say that ignorance is blissful then?
No, I don't think so. I think ignorance, in my opinion, is a bad thing, right? And I think, yeah, from a Blakean perspective, um,
But then the child going into the garden is really happy.
that's
They
true.
see the flowers and stuff.
That's true. So I think, so from Blakean's perspective, I think that that kind of Garden of Eden thing is more to do with, it's more to do with, yeah, ignorance, right? Whereas I would interpret that blissful Edenic state as something of more of like knowledge, right? Where it's like, but the right kind of knowledge.
And what kind of knowledge would this be?
I'm not 100% sure like exactly how to articulate that, but I think that knowledge would be like it says, right? It's the garden of love, right? So knowledge of love and community, right? That sort of thing, like which I think even in the poem you could make an argument for that it's more to do with they weren't ignorant, right? Not so much ignorant as they actually had a higher kind of knowledge, right? Instead of these dogmatic impositions from the chapel, and the priests going around the garden, there's just this free knowledge where they just know, right? They know what it is to be in the garden of love, right? So I think that you could say that instead of ignorance, they actually have knowledge of what love is, what they're kind of like how to be in a community with others, how to play, how to have fun, and it's a higher kind of knowledge, even though it's kind of looked down upon as something like naive, and
But it's knowledge that you get before, you know,
yeah, like before
earlier in life.
yeah, before like you have like the very like scientific, exacting, pinpointed truths, like which you find out about later, but it's more like an open knowledge, like just a natural knowledge of like yeah, that's what I think that maybe even Blake means. Definitely what I would interpret as being a blissful state, right? Knowledge, but of something like love.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that such knowledge, you know, love and hatred and sadness, these are such innate emotions which actually I think can cloud over everything. You know, there's another interpretation that the garden always stays the same and is changeless, and it's actually, you know, both flowers and the chapel are always there, and it's simply the person entering the garden that projects their subjective view onto the garden. And then it's the same as, you know, you can go on a walk around your house and you can do this walk like 1,000 times, but each time the same tree will be different in color if you're sad or if you're happy.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so I think Blake really focused on like subjectivity of religious experience, And I think that subjectivity really sheds light on how people view religion today. Like it's very, like you kind of choose maybe your, it's very like preference based.
Yeah.
Sort of
There's
like,
more freedom.
I would say so, but also like the extent of like, it's to the extent that maybe people don't look so much for, it's what works for them, right? Rather than looking for an objective thing, they're looking for something subjective. So they'll say, oh, this works for me. Like, oh, I've never really connected to this, but this does, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, that approach is like fairly modern, I think. So, like the idea of choosing something you like is very prevalent. And it's not even necessarily about what you think is true, it's about what you like. So, on that point, you met a shaman the other week.
I did meet a shaman.
And
I think he was an unofficial shaman. Though.
Yeah, so we could talk about that. So his religious preference, I guess, was a kind of like shamanistic practice and definitely like dress style, these sort of things.
Yeah.
And
he rejected organized religion.
Yeah, so that for that reason as well, he was also very into like festivals, like art festivals like Burning Man, which is explicit in its rejection of organized religion, especially of Christianity.
Yeah, and self-expression and all that.
Yeah, so it's all about self-expression instead. So in the same way, Blake pioneered that, whether for good or for bad, but it's definitely true that Blake, you could argue, influenced a lot of the New Age movement, which kind of has never died, right? For instance, Huxley, who writes about the doors of perception, where he had an essay called Doors of Perception. And
from Blake's phrase. He just did.
He took the quote, which he put directly in there, and there's a lot of like maybe more New Age spirituality, which is quite Blakean. So he pioneered having like a free, visionary, mystical approach. So yeah, and do you want to just talk briefly about this shamanistic old man?
I mean, he was quite the character, and he was talking a lot about how nowadays people are very concerned with the mind and psychological struggles, whereas humans are actually really simple. So a lot of times it's just about biological things which make you have these psychological problems, and it's not about the brain, but it's about the body, and like it's very simple. I mean, sometimes it can be just the brain not getting enough of something, and that's why you feel a certain way, and it's not all theoretical, I guess.
So I wonder if you believe in something similar to Blake, right? Like a golden age of, or not necessarily a golden age, but like a state of innocence, without any imposition, where like people are free and they attain to a kind of blissful state.
So basically what I gather is that you can achieve this blissful state through experience as well, just by focusing on the experience you have when you're younger, or more whole experience.
Yeah, like I definitely think like there's that nostalgia in this poem, The Garden of Love, and also typically in people's like modern religious experiences, like for instance when people at Burning Man, it's just very well known that like drugs play up into that, right?
Yeah.
And I think people often see that attaining to the childhood state, the blissful childhood state, is rewarding, and that spiritual experience, I think it's like once again it's modern. It's not something which you would have had 100 years ago, or in the Romantic period when Blake was writing. Like that's why he pioneered it, for better or worse. Like whether like I was saying before, these things could be spiritually harmful. I mean, we know like the kind of harm of like something like Burning Man festival is like quite notorious for being very extreme.
Yeah, I mean, you see it a lot when people try to achieve a higher truth, where they start to utilize substances. And I find it really interesting. Ralph Waldo Emerson did an essay, The Poet, and he said that the poet must live a lifestyle of purity and drink God's wine, which is basically just water, if he wishes to awaken his imagination. which imagination, once it's awakened, it will open the human doors, and as he says, quote, true nectar, the true nectar, new energy, will override his conscious intellect. However, he said that the sublime vision comes to the pure and simple soul in a clean and chaste body. And when people try to achieve this with a shortcut of, I don't know, psychoactive substances, and in Emerson's words, they're trying to take advantage of nature by a trick. And this shortcut will imminently bring deterioration as well as the new energy, which is quite interesting. So I guess it won't work.
So it's that deterioration, like, and that cheating nature of instead of having these natural, perhaps divine or mystical experiences, by doing that shortcut, like taking substances, in a way, it will never bring the kind of true garden of love, the garden of Eden, which Blake has in mind, right? I think that we'll have to talk about that in a future episode.
Yes, it's quite a broad topic.
It's a very broad topic,
yeah.
So we could talk a bit about how Blake viewed substances and whether these are a good means to get to a mystical experience or whether you should just go for a natural means.
So I think that just about concludes our episode on Blake and the Garden of Love. And I hope you've enjoyed this first episode. If you've made it this far, congratulations.
Yeah, one listener.
Yeah, from a waffle.
I hope you enjoyed it. And we hope to see you in many more episodes.
Yes, and we're now going to play you a song by Allen Ginsberg, which is, interestingly, about the Garden of Love. It's called The Garden of Love.
I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green, and the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not rid over the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires.